That Sunday dinner felt like every other one we'd had at her parents' place. The kind of evening that had become so routine I could have navigated it with my eyes closed. The house itself was quiet in that expensive, well-insulated way, the kind where you never hear the neighbors and every sound feels intentional. The table was set perfectly. Real plates, cloth napkins, the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. Melissa sat across from me, legs crossed, smiling politely, the same smile she always wore around her parents. I'd been with her long enough that the scene felt almost scripted. Her dad asked about work. Her mom commented on the roast. I nodded, answered, laughed at the right moments. It was calm, familiar, safe, or at least I thought it was. Melissa started talking about her job. Nothing unusual there. She worked in a competitive office, and she liked to vent about it over dinner. She mentioned a coworker, a guy I'd heard about before, one of those names that comes up often enough that you remember it without trying. She praised his confidence, his ambition, the way he just goes for what he wants. Her parents smiled, clearly impressed, and I sat there listening, not threatened, just mildly bored. Then she laughed softly and said it, so casually that for a split second my brain didn't register the words properly. She said that if he ever asked her to leave with him, she probably would. She didn't stumble or backtrack. She smiled when she said it, like she just made a harmless observation about the weather. The room went completely still. I could hear the hum of the lights overhead, the faint ticking of a clock somewhere behind me. Her fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her mom's smile collapsed into something tight and uncertain. Her dad cleared his throat and then seemed to think better of it. No one laughed. No one spoke. I looked at Melissa, really looked at her, waiting for the follow-up, the awkward laugh, the "I'm kidding," obviously. It never came. Her expression didn't change. There was no embarrassment in her eyes, no realization that she'd said something cruel or inappropriate. That was the moment it hit me that this wasn't a joke or a slip. It was a statement, a declaration made in the safest place she knew, in front of the people whose approval mattered most to her. I felt something inside me go very quiet. Not anger, not even sadness, just a strange, hollow clarity. I didn't raise my voice or ask her what she meant. I didn't argue or defend myself. I set my fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the plate. Because suddenly details like that mattered, I thanked her parents for the dinner, for the invitation, for always being welcoming. My voice sounded steady to my own ears, almost attached, like I was listening to someone else speak. Her mom tried to say something, my name half formed in her mouth. But I was already standing up. Melissa finally looked confused then, like she couldn't understand why the scene wasn't following the script anymore. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and nodded once politely to both of her parents. I didn't look back at Melissa as I walked toward the door. My hands didn't shake when I turned the knob. The cool night air outside felt sharper than it should have, like it was cutting through whatever warmth I had left. I heard the door close behind me, soft but final, and I stood there for a moment on the porch, breathing in, breathing out, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into place. I didn't feel proud of my composure, and I didn't feel shocked by it either. It just felt necessary. Something had broken at that table, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly, and I knew without a doubt that there was no fixing it. The drive home felt longer than it ever had. Even though I took the same route I always did, past the same intersections and glass office buildings glowing against the dark sky. The city lights blurred slightly through the windshield, not because I was crying or panicking, but because my mind was finally doing something I had avoided for a long time. With the radio off and the hum of the engine filling the car, memories started lining up on their own, clicking into place with a precision that made my chest feel tight. Moments I had shrugged off or explained away replayed themselves, not as isolated incidents anymore, but as pieces of the same picture. I thought about how often she'd been working late over the past year, how those nights had gone from occasional to routine, without me really noticing the shift. At first, I'd admired her ambition, told myself it was normal for someone climbing the corporate ladder, even defended her when friends joked about how unavailable she'd become. Then there were the business trips that always seemed to pop up last minute. The one she'd mentioned casually while packing a bag I hadn't seen her use before. I remembered how she'd stopped asking me to come along to work events, saying it was better for her image to show up alone. How I'd nodded like that made sense. At red lights, I caught my reflection in the windshield and almost laughed at how obvious some things looked in hindsight. Her phone was always face down, always locked, even when she left the room for a second. If it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly and slide it into her pocket, telling me it was just work. I remember the sudden upgrade in her wardrobe, the expensive clothes she claimed were bonuses or discounts, The kind of labels you don't accidentally buy. There was a perfume too, new and sharp, nothing like what she used to wear, something she said a co-worker recommended. I'd noticed how she started going to the gym more, changing her hair, her makeup, her entire presentation, all while insisting it was just about feeling good for herself. Each memory landed without drama, without rage, like facts being filed into the correct folders at last. I realized how often I'd chosen comfort over clarity, how easy it had been to trust a version of her I wanted to believe in rather than the one standing right in front of me. That comment at dinner hadn't created this reality. It had just stripped away the last excuse I had to ignore it. The calm I felt wasn't denial anymore, it was acceptance, and that scared me less than I expected. By the time I pulled onto my street, my thoughts had settled into something solid. The duplex came into view, small, unremarkable, the porch light casting a dull yellow circle onto the cracked concrete. I parked and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, aware of the irony pressing down on me. The place I called home, the one I paid rent for every month, belonged to her parents I'd signed, at least thinking it was convenient, practical, another sign of how intertwined our lives were becoming now. It just felt like one more loose end waiting to be dealt with. I stepped out of the car and locked it, the sound echoing softly in the quiet street. As I walked up the door, I didn't feel desperate or lost. I felt focused, like someone who had finally stopped arguing with reality. Inside, the space was quiet, exactly as I'd left it. And for the first time in a long while, that silence didn't feel lonely. It felt honest. Whatever came next wasn't about proving anything or salvaging what was already gone. It was about taking control of my own footing again, one deliberate step at a time, with my eyes open and my resolve steady. Once the door closed behind me, I didn't pace or replay the dinner again. I didn't sit on the couch staring at the wall either. I took my jacket off, hung it where it belonged, and walked into the bedroom with a kind of quiet intention that surprised even me. There was no rush, no spike of emotion pushing my hands. I opened the closet and stood there for a second, scanning what was mine and what wasn't, and the line between the two felt clearer than it ever had. I pulled out an empty box from the hall closet, set it on the bed, and started with her clothes. I folded everything carefully, the way she liked it done, jeans stacked evenly, dresses laid flat, sweaters rolled instead of creased. Shoes came next, paired and placed in their original boxes when I could find them. I didn't throw anything or rush through drawers. I moved through the room methodically, like I was inventorying a space rather than dismantling a relationship. Her cosmetics were lined up on the bathroom counter, each bottle wiped clean, before being wrapped and packed. The kitchen followed, her specialty pans, the mug she always reached for first, the matching set of glasses she insisted we needed. Each box was labeled neatly on the side. Clothes, shoes, bathroom, kitchen, miscellaneous. Nothing dramatic, nothing passive-aggressive. My phone started buzzing early on. The first call come before I finished the second box. I flipped it face down on the table and kept working. The buzzing didn't stop. Calls turned into messages. Messages stacked on top of each other. Her name lighting up the screen again and again. Then her parents. Then numbers I recognized as friends. I didn't read any of it. The phone stayed where it was. Silent to me. Irrelevant to what I was doing. Whatever needed to be said had already been said at that dinner table, even if no one else had realized it yet. Hours passed without me noticing. The sun dipped low, light shifting to the windows, and still I worked at the same steady pace. I didn't pack things that were shared or ambiguous. If it wasn't clearly hers, it stayed. There was no room for confusion or later arguments. When I was done, every item of her life that existed in that space was contained, accounted for, and sealed. I carried the boxes one by one to the porch, stacking them carefully against the wall. Protected from the evening air, the final thing I placed on top was a single sheet of paper with a short note written in plain ink, her belongings. Everything accounted for. I stepped back inside and locked the door, the sound firm and final in the quiet house. Inside, the space felt different, not empty exactly, but reset, like a room after a long overdue cleaning. I turned off the lights, sat down, and finally picked up my phone long enough to silence it completely. Then I waited. There was no anger burning in my chest, no urge to explain myself or defend my decision. I had done what needed to be done with precision and respect, and that was enough. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was controlled, deliberate, and for the first time that day, completely mine. She came back late, long after the street had gone quiet and the neighbors' lights had gone out. The kind of late that assumes forgiveness is still on the table if you just show up and knock. I heard her car before I saw it. tires rolling too fast over the cracked pavement, the engine cutting off abruptly. From the window, I watched her step onto the porch and freeze when she saw the boxes stacked neatly against the wall. For a moment she just stood there, staring, as if the scene might rearrange itself if she waited long enough. Then she tried the door. The handle rattled once, twice, harder the second time, followed by a knock that was sharp and impatient, the kind she used when she was already annoyed before a conversation even started. I stayed where I was, sitting in the dark, breathing evenly, listening. Her voice carried through the door, calling my name with forced calm at first, telling me we needed to talk, that this was ridiculous, that I was being dramatic. When that didn't work, the calm cracked. She knocked again, louder this time, then started pounding, her words tumbling over each other, insisting this wasn't how adults handle problems, that I couldn't just shut her out. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the door or my phone. I let the silence do the work for me. Her tone shifted again, dropping into something softer, almost pleading. She said she was tired, that it had been a long day, that whatever happened at dinner had been taken out of context. She promised explanations, clarity, honesty, all the things she hadn't offered when they actually mattered. I listened to every word without reacting, not because it was difficult to respond, but because there was nothing left to say. The door between us wasn't just wood and metal anymore. It was a boundary I wasn't willing to blur. When pleading failed, anger took its place. She accused me of overreacting, of humiliating her, of making her look unstable. She said her parents owned the place and that she had rights, that she could call a lawyer, that she could force her way back in if she wanted to. Her voice shook as she said it, the threat hollow and desperate. I knew the truth, that the lease was in my name, that her claims were noise meant to provoke a response. Any response at all. I gave her none. Eventually, the shouting broke down into crying, the kind that comes when there's no audience left to perform for. She slid down against the door, her back thudding softly as she sat, words dissolving into sobs that echoed faintly through quiet night. I closed my eyes and let the sound pass over me without reaching for it. I didn't feel satisfaction or cruelty in that moment, just a steady certainty that opening the door would undo everything I had already finished. Time stretched, the crying slowed, turned into sniffles, then stopped altogether. I heard her stand, the scrape of shoes on concrete, the rustle of cardboard as she started moving the boxes one by one. She carried them to her car, the trunk opening and closing with dull, final sounds. She struggled with the heavier ones, muttered under her breath, wiped her face with the back of her hand. No one helped her, no one interrupted her. When the last box was loaded, she stood there for a second longer, looking at the door like she expected it to change its mind. Then she got in the car, slammed the door, and drove away, headlights cutting briefly across the living room wall before disappearing down the street. The house went quiet again, deepened before, untouched by echoes or unfinished arguments. I stayed where I was, not because I was waiting for something else to happen, but because there was nothing left to manage. It ended without shouting, without insults, without chaos, not with a fight, but with a closed door that never opened again, and that finality felt heavier and cleaner than any argument ever could. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in over the next few days through fragments and secondhand conversations, the kind that reach you even when you're not looking for them. A friend texted asking if I was okay, phrasing it carefully, like they were stepping around something fragile. Another sent a message saying they'd heard things and wanted to check in. The wording was always vague, but the pattern was obvious enough. Melissa had started talking, and the version she was telling painted me as someone who snapped, someone who lost control, and threw her out in the middle of the night. According to her, I'd gone cold and cruel without warning, reduced years together to boxes, on a porch like it meant nothing. I listened without correcting anyone, without defending myself, because I didn't feel the need to compete with a narrative built on panic. What struck me was how consistent her story was in its omissions. There was no mention of that dinner, no acknowledgement of what she'd said or how calmly I'd left. The silence on those details told me more than any accusation could. Friends who knew me well enough heard the gaps and read between the lines. They didn't confront me or demand explanations. They just showed up in small ways, a call, a coffee, a message saying they were around if I needed anything. That quiet support mattered more than public validation ever could. I went about my days without urgency, settling into a routine that felt stripped down but honest. The place was quieter, cleaner, less crowded by someone else's energy. I slept better than I had in months. Whatever version of me she was circulating out there didn't feel connected to who I actually was, and that disconnect made it easier to let it pass without reaction. Then the email arrived, unannounced and unmistakably careful. It came from an address I didn't recognize at first, a professional signature, polite language, someone choosing their words with restraint. The sender explained they work with Melissa and felt compelled to reach out after hearing what was being said about me. They wrote that they couldn't stay silent anymore, not after watching a lie take shape around someone who hadn't done what they were being accused of. The message was direct without being dramatic. They confirmed what I already suspected but hadn't known for certain, that Melissa had been involved in an affair for 8 months with the same co-worker she praised so openly at dinner. The details were factual and restrained dates, late nights that weren't about work, trips that weren't about business. The man was married. He had children. Several people at the office knew, and the tension had been there long, before it ever brushed against my life. The sender didn't ask me to do anything with the information. They just wanted me to know the truth before the story around me solidified into something permanent. I read the email once, then again, absorbing it without the surge of emotion I might have expected. There was no anger waiting underneath, no desire to confront or expose anyone. What I felt was a clean sense of confirmation, like the final piece sliding into a puzzle that was already complete. The decision I'd made had been the right one even before I had all the facts. I hadn't acted out of suspicion or jealousy. I'd acted out of self-respect. Responding to exactly what had been placed in front of me, I didn't forward the email or use it as ammunition. I archived it and went on with my day. The smear campaign lost its power the moment I stopped needing the truth to arrive before my actions were justified. Knowing what I knew now didn't change the ending. It just clarified that the calm, methodical way I'd walked away wasn't premature or harsh. It was precise. I had closed the door before the full weight of the lie could land on me, and that clarity settled in quietly, without triumph or bitterness, just a steady sense that I had trusted myself at the exact moment it mattered most. The pressure started quietly, almost politely, which somehow made it worse. A voicemail from her father came first. His tone measured but tight, reminded me that the property belonged to them and that this situation had been handled poorly on my end. He talked about disappointment, about how hurt Melissa was, about how families should work through things instead of making rash decisions. Her mother followed an email that leaned harder on guilt, mentioning all the times they'd welcomed me into their home, all the ways they treated me like family, and how shocked they were by my behavior. There were no apologies in any of it, no acknowledgement of what had actually happened, just an expectation that I should bend because they were uncomfortable with the outcome. I responded once, briefly and without emotion, stating that communication should be limited to matters directly related to the lease and nothing else. I didn't justify myself or explain my reasoning. I didn't engage with their disappointment or their attempts to rewrite events. Facts were enough. That seemed to irritate them more than anger ever could. The next message hinted at eviction, wrapped in careful language about reviewing options and reconsidering arrangements. I didn't react outwardly. I took screenshots, saved voicemails, and started a folder where everything went dated and untouched. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer a few days later, brought copies of the lease, payment records, and the messages I'd already documented. The meeting was straightforward and almost boring, which was exactly what I needed. He confirmed what I already suspected, that the lease was valid, that I was protected, that eviction wasn't something they could just decide on a whim, and that any retaliation tied to personal issues would only work against them. He advised me to keep documenting everything and to communicate only in writing if I had to respond at all. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter, not because I was gearing up for a fight, but because I understood the boundaries clearly now. The tone from her parents shifted again after that, less subtle this time. An official-looking notice arrived informing me of a rent increase, justified with vague references to market conditions and property costs. The timing wasn't subtle. It landed less than a week after their earlier messages went unanswered. I read it once, set it down, and felt a kind of tired clarity settle in. I could fight it, drag things out, document more, push back legally, and probably win, but the idea of staying there under that kind of tension felt exhausting in a way I didn't need to endure. That was the moment I chose a clean exit over a prolonged standoff, not because I was afraid or pressured, but because I didn't want to live inside someone else's bitterness. I started looking for a new place the same day, somewhere neutral, somewhere that wasn't tied to anyone's family or history. I gave proper notice, followed every clause of the lease to the letter, and continued documenting everything until the end. There were no emotional conversations, no final confrontations, no dramatic send-offs, just paperwork, timelines, and distance. As the days passed, the attempts at contact slowed, then stopped altogether, replaced by silence that felt earned rather than imposed. I realized then that staying calm and factual had done more to protect me than any argument ever could have. I hadn't needed to threaten or escalate. I'd simply refused to be pulled into a narrative that wasn't mine and chosen to step away instead. The legal reality gave me security, but the decision to leave gave me peace, and that distinction mattered more than winning anything on paper. Finding the new apartment happened faster than I expected, not because I rushed, but because I finally knew exactly what I wanted. Something simple, quiet, and entirely mine, with no invisible strings attached. I signed a lease, scheduled the move, and didn't tell anyone connected to Melissa or her family what I was doing. I packed the rest of my things the same way I'd packed hers weeks earlier, calmly and efficiently, without sentimentality. On moving day, there was no drama, no surprise visits, no last-minute messages trying to reopen conversations that were already finished. I loaded the truck, cleaned the duplex thoroughly, and left it better than I'd found it. Returning the keys was a final administrative step, and it felt almost anticlimactic. I dropped them off exactly as outlined in the lease, documented the condition of the place, and walked away without lingering. There was no sense of loss standing there, just closure. That address no longer belonged to my life in any meaningful way, and neither did the family tied to it. The last practical tie was severed with a click of metal and a closed door, and nothing followed me out. A few days after the move, a package showed up at my new place with Melissa's name on the return label. I recognized her handwriting immediately. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I taped it back up, wrote return to sender, unopened, and dropped it off the next morning. Whatever it was, apology, explanation, gift, attempt at leverage, it didn't matter. Accepting it would have reopened a channel I'd already shut down with intention. With the noise gone, space opened up in my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. I started reconnecting with friends I'd slowly drifted from, not because of any dramatic fallout, but because I finally had the energy to show up again. Dinners were easy, conversations lighter, laughter more frequent. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. Holidays came and went without tension or obligation, spent with people who didn't require me to explain myself or manage their expectations. There were no eggshells to navigate, no undercurrent of anxiety humming beneath every interaction. The most unexpected part was how my body responded to the change. I slept deeply. I woke up without that familiar tightness in my chest. Decisions felt simpler. I didn't replay past conversations or wonder if I'd been too harsh or too quiet. There was no second guessing, no urge to revisit the ending and edit it. The way things had ended felt complete, like a sentence with proper punctuation instead of a trailing ellipsis. As weeks passed, I noticed how light everything felt, not in an exaggerated or euphoric way, but in a steady, grounded sense. I could breathe without effort. My thoughts weren't crowded by what-ifs or unfinished arguments. The calm wasn't something I had to maintain or defend. It was just there, consistent and real. Walking away cleanly had given me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for a long time, not just freedom from a relationship, but freedom from the constant low-level stress of ignoring my own instincts. There was no dramatic new beginning, no sudden reinvention of who I was. Life simply continued, quieter and clearer, and that was enough. I had made a decision, followed through on it without cruelty or chaos, and built something stable on the other side. The chapter closed without noise, and the absence of turmoil wasn't emptiness. It was peace, and it fit better than anything I'd been holding on to before. Months passed without any dramatic milestones to mark the time, just a steady accumulation of ordinary days that felt surprisingly solid. My life didn't snap into some perfect shape overnight, but it settled, like dust after a door finally closes. I wasn't dating, not intentionally at least, just living without the background noise I'd grown used to for years. Then I met Sophie in the most unremarkable way possible, through mutual friends at a low-key gathering where no one was trying to impress anyone else. She was direct without being blunt, warm without being performative, and from the start there was no sense of maneuvering or subtext. Conversations with her didn't feel like puzzles I had to solve or performances I had to maintain. What she said matched what she did, and that consistency was something I'd forgotten could feel so natural. Spending time with her was easy in a way that didn't rely on intensity or constant reassurance. There were no tests disguised as jokes, no strategic silences, no moments where I felt like I had to read between the lines to understand what was actually being communicated. When something mattered to her, she said it. When something bothered her, she addressed it calmly instead of letting it fester. I didn't feel rushed or pressured to define anything, and at the same time there was no ambiguity about respect or intention. It was quiet, honest, and emotionally grounded, and I realized how much energy I'd been wasting before just trying to keep the peace in a dynamic that was never stable to begin with. By then, Melissa barely crossed my mind at all, which is why the email caught me off guard when it finally arrived. It was long, detailed, and written with the kind of clarity that only seems to come once there's nothing left to lose. She acknowledged the affair, the lies, the way she tried to shift blame when everything unraveled. She apologized for the dinner, for the smear campaign, for putting me in a position where silence was the only dignified response left. She wrote about regret, about growth, about understanding now what she hadn't been willing to see then. I read it slowly, all the way through, not because I felt compelled to forgive or respond, but because I wanted to be sure of my own reaction. What surprised me most was the absence of any real emotion. There was no anger resurfacing, no vindication, no sense of relief. The words landed, registered, and passed through me without resistance. I didn't feel validated or wounded or tempted to reopen anything. The apology didn't change my understanding of the past or my satisfaction with how I'd handled it. I closed the email, deleted it, and emptied the trash, not as an act of defiance or cruelty, but because it was finished, there was nothing left for me to carry. That was when it became clear that closure hadn't been something I was waiting for from her, even if I hadn't realized at the time I created myself months earlier by walking away the moment respect was openly discarded. I hadn't needed all the facts to justify that decision, and getting them later didn't alter its value to peace. I felt now wasn't dependent on apologies or explanations arriving on schedule. It came from trusting my own judgment and acting on it without drama or hesitation. Life continued forward, not louder or more exciting. Just steadier. I showed up more fully in my relationships, spoke more plainly, and paid attention to the early signals I used to dismiss. There was no urge to look back or reframe the ending into something softer. It had ended exactly as it needed to. I hadn't escaped a bad situation by chance or luck. I'd stepped out of it deliberately, and everything that followed, including the calm I now lived with, grew from that single, quiet decision to choose myself when it mattered most.